Hello and welcome to Setting the Stage, episode 54, Dylan and the Faerun Crystal War. Alright, today I'm here talking with Dylan on his campaign, which is the Crystal War set in Faerun, which is cool. We don't actually, even though it's the base setting, we haven't actually done something that's like really the base setting of D&D before, so this is fun. But before we get into that, I want to hear about who Dylan is outside of RPGs and all that.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on here, Isaac. So, in terms of what I do outside of RPG, I am a registered veterinary technician, RVT for short. Effectively, I am the equivalent of an RN, but in the animal field. So, I do pretty much all the things from drawing blood on animals and getting x-rays and filling medications the doctor prescribes, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty much being the doctor's right-hand person. My license is also what allows me to run anesthesia for animals and things like that. So I have all that training and knowledge on how to appropriately handle anesthetic issues. I'm the lead RVT at a clinic that only sees exotic animals. So
Oh, okay.
we don't see dogs and cats. Everything, basically everything else, because in the veterinary field, that's what exotic medicine means. It's everything that's not a dog or a cat. So we see a lot of rabbits, a lot of other small mammals, reptiles, birds, all that kind of stuff. So every day I get to do something different, work with different types of animals, a lot of interesting things. So like that's definitely a thing that really drives me as well.
So the split that I'm familiar with in veterinary medicine is small animal and large animal between like
Yes,
pets and livestock, basically.
yes. And there's a lot of crossover in between things because certainly there is some large animal stuff that we might work with. We do occasionally see potbelly pigs, the rare goat, that kind of stuff. So there is some crossover because especially nowadays, a lot of people are keeping these kind of animals as pets. So they want to take better care of them rather than just like there's people keeping cows as pets. We're not going to see any cows because we can't fit them through the door, but
Right.
yeah, like there is some crossover, and certainly there are like exotic medicine is definitely seen as very separate because a lot of clinics, when you get your license in the veterinary field, it's a license to work with all but one animal, which is the human species. And otherwise, like I am licensed to work with whatever animal I want with. You then make that decision once you get your license, what you want to work with and how you focus in it. So like you would never take a dog to an equine vet because they're not going to remember everything from school like they do with horses.
Yeah, like their hearts are shaped differently.
There's a lot, yeah. There's a lot of anatomical and also just like the way they interact with drugs and whatnot, and the different diseases that they're more prone to having and everything.
Yeah,
So and how you
I'm
can
sure
actually
dogs get
inflict
all sorts of hoof rot.
it. Yeah. So there's a lot of times where it's like, yeah, like you can go to a dog and cat vet, but they're not going to know anything about exotic medicine. They might throw some stuff at it that's like very basic knowledge, but things that my clinic is allowed to really focus on exotic animals, and so we can provide a quality of medicine that those vets that are at least trying to help, but may not have all the knowledge there that we can provide on a level since we can focus that we are really focusing on
Yeah, that's pretty cool. One of my friends keeps bearded dragons,
that. Nice.
and yeah, there is this issue where like there's not many vets that will see bearded dragons, and then
Yeah.
there's like this community that has to be built around taking care of them
Yep.
without sort of vet advice and being like, oh yeah, if it's like having these symptoms, it's probably this, and here's how you treat it with like this medicine, and they're like sort of,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't want to call it self-diagnosis, but it's sort of unprofessional diagnosis.
Yeah, and that is something that we often have to combat with. There is a lot of good information out there, but because the internet is such a platform for everybody, it's hard to sift through that information. So really, the majority of my job is just educating clients because also in reality, 90% of the reason that exotic animals get sick is because of something wrong with the husbandry. So a lot of it is just me showing them ways to improve their husbandry, and then if they can fix that, then their animal will probably be perfectly healthy. Like we might need to prescribe some medications to help support that recovery. But a lot of, especially with reptiles, if we can fix the husbandry, a lot of health issues go away.
Yeah. Well, that's really cool. That's a service that you don't. It is sort of lacking because people don't will sort of forget that these are often pets.
Yeah. So completely unrelated to anything to do with the fantasy world. Uh, but otherwise, that's kind of my main thing.
Hmm.
Languages are another big part of my interests.
Oh yeah. How many languages do you speak?
Oh boy. Fluently, I can obviously speak English, French, Italian, pretty good at Spanish. Once you basically learn one Romance language, you can kind of get the idea of some of the other ones.
Yeah, I feel like my Spanish is good enough to go to Portugal now.
Yeah, pretty much. I took a trip to El Salvador with my girlfriend, where her family is from, and I was able to get around pretty okay.
Yeah, and like French was a second language for everyone
Mm,
else in my family,
okay.
so and I chose Spanish, and it was like I could understand what they were saying, but I couldn't quite talk back to them.
Yeah, that's what I got a lot from my like classmates that already spoke Spanish, but were learning French. Like, okay, yeah, I can see the similarities.
Mhm.
I also grew up in a town where the primary, like 90% of the demographic is actually American-born Chinese.
Oh,
So I do actually have a lot of interaction and do understand quite a bit of Cantonese, at least at a somewhat conversational level. And my Mandarin, I'm working on a little bit more so that I can actually make it useful and be able to help our local community that mostly speaks Chinese.
hmm.
And I know like little bits and pieces of other languages such as Japanese and Greek and Latin and Russian. I know some American Sign Language, German, just some stuff that I did for funsies, pretty much.
Okay, yeah, that's I don't know, I lost track there. Under 10, but
Yeah,
close to
something like
10.
that.
And yeah, like you said, it sort of depends on what you count as fluency, I suppose. But
Exactly. Some of them I can have a conversation in. I'm a little rusty on my American Sign Language. I can probably get back into practicing that. But yeah,
oh, you even did sign language. I think I missed that one.
yeah, I did it for a little while. I had some friends that were deaf at one point, but our paths kind of separated at some point, and I haven't had a chance to practice it in a long time. I've had a few clients at work where I've helped them out because they were deaf and was able to make the process easier for them. But yeah,
Do you feel like it's easier to remember sign language because it's physical compared to the other languages?
it does help definitely that it's more of a visual aspect so you can just mime the thing you're doing. A lot of signs are literally just you miming the action, so that does help a lot. And the other thing too that actually funnily helps is my background interacting with the Chinese language. The grammar is actually almost the same between American Sign Language and Chinese. Both of them have very simplified grammar structures, and the
Hmm.
way that they structure their sentences is actually very similar.
Oh, that's interesting. I would think they would both keep sort of a similar grammar structure to the sort of parent language.
You would think so, but English and American Sign Language grammar are actually very different.
It's, I I guess I don't want to get into this whole like
Yeah, that's not what we're here for.
I'm curious about it, but part of this is there's no visual medium here for the
Exactly.
listeners or for me and you to understand this conversation. So,
Yes.
but thank you for sharing as far as we went there. Uh, yeah, going back to the stated focus of this podcast,
Yeah.
um, what got you into RPGs?
So it actually kind of runs in my blood, to be honest. So very similar to your story. I grew up around it. Almost everyone in my family has played at some point. Mostly my siblings, and then also my aunt and uncle, which I only have one of each anyway.
Mhm.
So they all have played at some point. The people that played the most were primarily my aunt, my oldest brother, and then various friends that they have and people that are very closely associated with our family. So I was always around it. I would always kind of hear my brother and his friends talking and playing and everything. I was always wanting to play, but they would always tell me, "Ah, you're too young to be hanging out with us." So I didn't really get a chance to play until later in life, more like middle school, maybe late elementary school.
Hmm.
My brother ran a campaign for me, his then girlfriend, now wife, and eventually another friend joined it at some point. But due to circumstances in my brother's life at that point, the game fell apart after really just a few sessions.
Hmm.
Um, and then when I really got into it, which actually another thing that actually I forgot to mention that happened too was
Yeah.
me and one of my longest time friends. I've known him since the third grade. We both he had a similar thing where he was aware of Dungeons and Dragons from his older brother, and when we were kids, we did something where we basically brought dice to school and said we were playing Dungeons and Dragons when we really weren't following the rules of Dungeons and Dragons, but just kind of messing around.
Uh-huh.
And then later in high school, that same friend and I started an actual campaign in like junior year, senior year, and had another friend join in. We went through trying to do it online. Really didn't work out for me. I was using a map tools. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I am. Yeah. That is a difficult program to use, but
Yeah.
I mean, back in the day, it was the tool available.
Yep. And so I was having a lot of issues with that. And in general, I have some difficulty with being able to hear everybody talking when in an online medium and being able to really process
Everyone
everything.
does.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's not you. That's just the way it's structured.
Yeah. So definitely being in person always turns out the best for me. We eventually turned that game into an in-person game only. And that game is really what started the whole Crystal Wars series that we are going to talk about today.
Uh-huh.
And then from there, I've had multiple other games. I was the DM of that campaign because I was the one with the most experience with the game. And I've also had other games with other people of varying lengths of time, teaching a lot of people how to play the game who had never had a chance to play before but always wanted to. And I currently have a group where we mostly play Pathfinder. Um, so as I mentioned in my questionnaire, I've had experience. I started off with 2e, AD&D, and moved on to fourth edition, hated fourth edition, moved on to Pathfinder, and that's pretty much what I've mostly been playing with a little bit of fifth edition sprinkled in here and there.
Yeah, that was an unusual thing in your survey where you mentioned that you did second edition and skipped third edition. I have never seen someone do that before, skipping from second to fourth.
I think it was just the timing of everything. So like
Uh-huh.
probably by the time I was starting to play, technically third edition was probably the main one people were playing. However,
Mhm.
my brother was primarily playing second edition, and we had a whole lot of books and material for it, so we stuck with that one. And then when I started playing with my friends, that's about probably when fourth edition was big, and Pathfinder was also becoming a thing because people were defecting to Pathfinder from fourth edition, and I followed that same suit.
Yeah, third edition was like late 90s, and fourth edition was 2007, 2008.
Yep, that sounds about right.
Okay, well, yeah, that's an unusual path for where you went.
Yeah,
But yeah, Pathfinder is a great place to go if you wanted more than second, but fourth is too much.
yeah, yeah. Fourth edition, I wasn't a big fan, mostly of just the feeling that it was kind of like an MMO, just in tabletop format.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Certainly, Pathfinder's not a perfect system either, but I do enjoy it.
I feel like the crunchier you get in a system, the more it starts to feel like a video game is kind of what's going on there.
Yeah,
And fourth edition just, really embraced that feel,
yeah,
which if that's what you're going for, it's fine. If
yeah,
it's not, then
yeah. Just wasn't my cup of tea.
yeah, of course. Okay. Well, yeah. Let's hear about the Crystal Wars. So that started off as something different and kind of evolved in that direction. Was that what you were saying earlier?
Yeah, so the campaign was just starting off in one direction. I was utilizing some characters from a previous campaign. To be honest, I was probably trying to be a little too serious with the game, and not having more fun with it than I could have. And I feel like it wasn't quite working out for the other players. And I started trying to implement some more of a puzzle system trying to like because combat just wasn't really the thing that a lot of my other players were the most interested in, and it was felt like it was dragging down the games most of the time. And so when I started the whole Crystal War thing, it originally the conceit of it was one of my other best friends who wasn't involved with the game had taken that level in 007 GoldenEye, the Nintendo 64 game,
Okay.
where it's this like whole kind of sci-fi labyrinthine kind of feel to it.
Uh-huh.
I forget the level is called, but there's an outdoor portion, there's an indoor portion.
There's like a bunch of teleporters.
Yes, and he took that, drew out a map of the entire level, and had that to be used for a D&D campaign. I took that map and extended it out further into multiple levels and created this whole thing where I decided that my players were going to be railroaded into a situation where effectively this person was coming asking them for help, but it was actually a plot to get them trapped inside this crystal. And that was kind of the most railroading I was doing at the time. I just wanted to get to that point.
Okay.
They reached the area where this guy was trying to lead them. The crystal has this ability where it has a bright flash of light. You get a wisdom or will saving throw. This was literally where we started using Pathfinder in this campaign because we had started with 4th edition. And then literally as we were moving into the crystal, it became a Pathfinder game. So
it's like Wizard of Oz.
yeah. And we had a few other things that happened too, but basically they got into the crystal, and inside the crystal was this maze. And I wanted it to be sort of a more sort of problem solving aspect of the game. There was some combat, but them trying to solve a lot of problems rather than focusing on the combat. And so that was really the original conceit of the game. And
Okay.
then I started just coming up with this whole storyline behind the crystal. And effectively what it is, one of the things I was really interested in with the 2nd edition stuff was Planescape. And I used to read a lot of the books just to get a feel for all the different planes and everything.
Uh-huh.
The game was, of course, set in Faerun because I'm big into Faerun. I read the Drizzt books when I was a kid and read some other stuff.
Yep. Yeah, they're good books.
Yep.
Well, that's better. They're addictive books. Maybe that's a
Yes.
better way of phrasing it.
Yeah. I fell out of it after a while, but that's another story for another day. I started coming up with this idea where this crystal was actually the sentient being. And it has the ability to mind control those that fail that saving throw and end up inside the crystal. And this maze is pretty much just the way that it pushes their mind into something else, kind of like the labyrinth spell. And then it has free reign to control their body. And then the time frame of me coming up with all these ideas is pretty scattered, but the general idea that I eventually finalized was
Yeah.
this plane, this iteration of Faerun, which I have actually set 100 years after the death of Drizzt, because I wanted this to be like pretty far into the future.
I was curious about like that specific time point you picked because like Drizzt hasn't technically died as far as Faerun is right now.
Exactly.
He's
And
been alive for 200 years now.
yeah, and so it basically gave me like a nebulous time frame, a time scale to like work with that. I don't have to worry too much about pre-written material and then really start building my own thing. And I just had such a love for Faerun and was so familiar with Faerun that was my starting point. And then I was able to look at things that were going on in the like current settings and then extrapolate of what would happen in the future and make it my own thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's fair.
So in this iteration of Faerun, I basically decided on how the multiplanar system looks. All of the material planes are kind of like alternate realities, and they are kind of going forever in this 4th dimensional space, going onwards and onwards from each other. And the way that each material plane is created is from the the inner planes, the elemental planes, rotating around in this fourth dimensional space, but also being drawn towards the center slowly over time until they finally touch at a single point and create a new material plane. And in that energy, also they get bounced back into their outer orbit. And this constantly is happening. And I decided that this was happening that this was accelerating every time it happened until it was happening faster and faster, until basically these material planes were piling up on each other, causing these planar anomalies to happen. Which I have a chart of like a D100 chart, basically, of things that could happen of different planar anomalies. And I would just kind of randomly roll these each session and decide what would happen.
Okay, so a bit different than the traditional sort of Spelljammer answer for how the different material planes interact, but
Pretty much, yeah.
more similar to like sort of overlapping parallel dimensions, kind of.
Yeah. And so, because this is all happening, these planes, these newer planes, which I figured Faerun would be in those newer planes, they are doomed for something bad to happen because of just everything piling up together. So, this first crystal that I created, I decided was part of this. It was a result of this, where imagining that the ideas of lawful, chaotic, good, and evil were also a physical aspect tied into these planes. And so one of the
I mean, they kind
anomalies,
of are for the outer planes.
pretty much, and since the material planes are so closely related to them by the fact that they are ruled by these outer planes for the most part,
Right.
and it's such an intrinsic part in D&D, like it is tied into different classes and everything, so it's such an important part of the fabric of D&D and Pathfinder, that I decided, okay, so there's a physical aspect to the alignments. This crystal is basically like a chunk of that falling down onto the surface. And this crystal specifically was the representation of lawful evil. I decided it would need to have an ability. Each crystal would need an ability, and each crystal would need a source of power. So this crystal has the ability to basically just control the bodies, creating this orderly system effectively. And the thing that would feed its power, the thing that would need to consume to be able to continue using its power and grow stronger, is precious metals and stones. So effectively, the players getting stuck in this crystal was just a smaller part of the crystal effectively trying to take over the whole world. And getting a whole bunch of mind controlled and getting these mind controlled to collect as much treasure as possible so it could consume it. I didn't really ever get into the effects on the economy in the game based on how that happening.
That's a rough question for D&D, so don't worry about it.
But that in the end became what this whole crystal was about. And the reason it's called the Crystal War is this crystal taking control of as many people as possible, just conquering, and other nations other cities then trying to be like, well, there's an issue happening, we need to resolve this. And it's a whole thing that basically takes 2 years. So the players go into this maze. When they eventually get out, they have been gone for 2 years basically. But they didn't feel like 2 years had passed. They were inside this maze. They did not feel like nearly that much time has passed. So there was an incongruent chronology.
Gotcha.
And basically, if somebody died within the crystal, their body would fall dead in real life. If somebody their body died in real life, they would die they would basically cease to exist in the crystal as well. So it was that whole thing. So this campaign, the original campaign, started off with them being inside the crystal, being within the maze, doing that whole thing. And then eventually they were trying to figure out how to leave this maze. They were trying to solve the puzzle to get out of it. At one point, I'm like, okay, they've been in here long enough. I think we can just go ahead and end this. They're struggling with trying to get out of here, and I think it's becoming less and less fun for everyone. So let me just go ahead and kick them out. And effectively, that was the 2 years point where the end of the war came, and the rest of Faerun was able to stop the crystal. And the other fun part was then them playing in the aftermath of that war and a lot of the things that happened because of it. One of the aspects that happened, so one of my players was originally playing a character named Isaiah Brofist.
Okay.
And he was a worshiper of a dead god named Prometheus, who brought broness to the people.
Of course.
So he was worshiping this god, and he was the only character who didn't get sucked into the crystal when they all went in, because that player wanted to actually switch characters. This character was kind of like a almost lawful good type, while the rest of the players were doing some things that weren't very kosher to a lawful good character. So he's like, you know what, let me just play a different character that might fit in better.
Okay.
So he lost control of that character, and I basically said that that character during that 2 years was basically leading the front against the crystal, because he was there when it first took his friends, and it started off with him trying to rescue his friends, and then it turned into a whole big war.
Right. Okay.
And that also, in the end, causes a revival of people being like worshiping this Prometheus guy and wanting, and the spread of that religion, and potentially even leading into the revival of Prometheus, which the campaign ended up falling apart before that could happen.
It's just sounding like the plot to Bill and Ted right now.
It's been a while since I watched that movie, so I couldn't say for sure, but
And not like
yeah,
the idea is that they're like destined to be like this band that
yeah, that like
creates a song that's
solves all of the world's
unifies
problems.
humanity.
Yeah,
Yeah. Be excellent to each other.
exactly. Yes, I do remember that part at least, and I have listened to a podcast where they do like a re-roll of that pretty much. But yeah, so that campaign then turned into the aftermath of it, which I did also run another campaign more recently with a different group that was, I wanted to play out what happened during the war. And so we had a lot of people come and go in that one, and flushing out what happened all in the middle of that, their interactions with this Isaiah Brofist, and their interactions with the mind controlled, and trying to figure out who is controlling them and what's the deal with this crystal. And also dealing with the fact that because the characters that my original party was playing were pretty high level at this point, the crystal ended up using them as like its main pretty much generals, because they had the most powerful abilities for it to be able to control. And one of them was actually a Warforged thrown back from the 4th edition game, and that I had converted into Pathfinder. And that Warforged, I allowed him to have a little chest cavity where he could store things. So the crystal effectively used the Warforged as his own little personal tank. And so the main thing was just like the idea, like basically I would always explain to people like, yeah, there's this Warforged going around flashing people, because it would open his chest cavity and then the crystal would literally flash and cause him to be mind controlled.
Oh, okay. They can't just do it through the chest plate. It
uh,
has to.
it was basically too opaque. It would need to be completely open for it to be able to have the flash be effective.
Okay.
And so as time went on, I also started coming up with other crystals for other alignments. One other one that was the other most prominent was the Lawful Good crystal, which was pink in color. The Lawful Evil was red in color. And so the pink one's power was that it could create its own energy-based facsimiles. So it could create like forms of people that it has seen and use those as sort of like bodies that it could interact to the world with.
Like the holodeck in Star Trek.
Pretty much, yes. The thing that fed it was knowledge. And effectively, it just needed to be able to consume like scraps of paper or anything that was a physical form of knowledge, and then it could store that knowledge as well and potentially do things like cast spells. But it needed to be constantly be learning new things to fuel its power.
Okay, so just like feed it a book instead of gems and jewels.
Pretty much. Now, because of that, and because it became such an important part in fighting the Lawful Evil crystal, one of the aftermath things that I had going on was that the Lawful Evil crystal knew that it was consuming knowledge, and so it started burning the books effectively.
Oh, okay.
So there was a world afterwards where many libraries were destroyed, and there was this one main library that was like the final bastion of knowledge. And that's where, after the war, the pink crystal goes to live, which most people refer to him as Pinky. That is where they basically, like, there's also a whole bunch of monks who just sit all day copying books from the library so they can feed it to the crystal, and then the crystal then provides service by offering by being able to create these facsimiles to also act as things like librarians and other services and do things. Since the more knowledge it consumes, it can have more facsimiles active at once.
Right. Uh, did you do all nine alignment crystals?
What I ended up finishing off with was those two and a chaotic evil, which did come up at one point, but it didn't play as big of a role. All the other crystals, than these two first ones, don't have a good way of communicating with the outside world. This one, the chaotic evil one, being a thing where its power was to make others desire to have it and to be paranoid, basically, of other individuals. But
Huh.
the thing it
Okay.
fed on was being in contact with people. It would actually suck your life force.
So it's always finding like a new sort of host to eat with that
Yeah.
setup.
Yep. And there was a player at one point where in the Aftermath campaign, uh, they had they wanted to play a new character. They brought this new character in, and he wanted to have like something special about him. So I gave him the chaotic evil crystal as like one of his inventory items. And there was a paladin NPC who then they got into a confrontation because he's like, that thing is evil. You should not have that. And so it was a whole confrontation between them. Yeah, and then there was like a whole moment where basically he was like, no, you, like, I told him like, no, you should not give this crystal to the paladin. It's your crystal. You absolutely should not part with it. So it was that kind of deal going on. Um, the chaotic good crystal, which never came up in the campaign, but was basically its ability was pretty much the idea of like breaking chains. So it had
Uh-huh.
the like effectively the ability of like the shatter spell. And I do not remember what it fed on. Yeah, I can't remember what the source of that one's power was, but effectively it had the ability to just shatter things. And the only other crystal I came up with, and that one was green. The chaotic evil was black. Then the final one that I came up with was the neutral crystal, and it effectively just had different abilities that were able to neutralize the other crystals. So it could do things like create inertia, so it could not be moved. It could also do things like disrupt energy constructs, and it had like an anti-magic kind of field around it, so mind controlled, and the energy constructs and whatnot could not be active. And so it basically just had abilities that could neutralize the other ones, and it just wanted nothing but to be left alone. And the thing that actually fed it was just being like completely stationary and nothing happening to it. So it just did not want to be moved or anything. So it was kind of like the idea of sloth. I started kind of associating seven deadly sins with each of these crystals at one point.
All right. You need to add on two extra ones, but yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so that was those are each of the crystals. But in the time of the campaigns, it was only ever really those two main ones plus the third one that were ever really involved or came up in the campaign.
Gotcha. The sort of impetus for these crystals, is there kind of a side effect of the crossing over of the planes? Was that what you were saying?
Yeah, so it's effectively a symptom of the bigger problem where the fabric of these planes is being disrupted from the other adjacent planes. There's just too much contact between them. And so one of the things that happened was just the physical essence of the alignments started breaking apart and falling on the plane. And that's where these crystals come from. They are effectively crystallized alignment energy.
Okay. And does that, I mean, you talked about what they do like directly, but is this like a separation of the idea of lawful good from the plane, so it can only kind of exist around that crystal, or is that still like people can still act that way?
Yeah, no, so people don't aren't like forced to act in that alignment. It's more so these crystals all have their own consciousness, and so they act in terms of their alignment. And if anyone ever, which nobody ever did, nobody ever figured this out. If you ever check their alignment, they would be so powerful in their alignment that it would have that like level 9 effect, where if you look at an entity that is, if you try to detect the alignment of an entity that is too powerful, then you can
Yeah,
potentially
like that
blind
does
them.
for magic stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, the crystals were more so bound in their alignment, not anyone around them.
And along the lines of like the crossing over events, was there any other stuff going on? Like usually when planes cross over, like in the Witcher, there's this like huge cataclysmic, the conjunction of the spheres kind of thing.
Yeah, so there was one of the things that was happening. So that planar anomaly table that I had created, I would roll every once in a while, and the further we get into the campaign, I would roll it more frequently as more things started to happen. And one of the things that would happen is there was a lot of plane jumping. Even some of the even like there was even some crossover with the outer planes, just because there was so much going on in the material planes that there could be jumps to the outer planes. And so there was times where characters would end up on the what was it called, the outer plane, that's basically the plane of law with the mechanist creatures pretty much. I forget what the name of the
Me-
plane is.
Mechanist?
I think so. Yeah, I was about to say I want to say it's that, but I didn't want to be just pulling things out of nowhere. But yes, so there would be times of that, or they would have a glimpse into a plane, or so if they weren't being transferred, a denizen from another plane could be transferred. So things like demons were just suddenly popping out of nowhere. A lot of times it was elemental kind of stuff going on, since it was primarily an interaction between the material planes and also the inner planes. So there would be things where, like, even if a character did something such as one time one of the characters casted a fireball and had put a lot of power behind it, and it caused a forest fire, which then led to that kind of becoming a opening into the plane of fire. And so fire
Oh, okay.
elementals started pouring out of it at one point. So things like that also happened because it was just
That's an
such,
out of control wildfire.
yep. So just a lot of instability in the planes. And so that kind of stuff was all ramping up. And the eventual plan was to be, well, because I had gotten Prometheus so involved in the plane, the eventual end of the campaign, after things were settled with the crystals and other character storylines were wrapped up, because I love introducing character backstories into the campaigns as well. The final phase would have been the characters having to go to the astral plane, find the dead corpse of Prometheus, because that's where usually the dead gods would go. Their bodies would just be floating around in the astral plane, and try to eventually effectively resurrect him by utilizing the amount of faith that had been spreading throughout Faerun. Because then, if they could resurrect a god who had a vested interest in this plane existing and staying existing, then maybe they'd be able to get it protected once they had more of an idea of what was going on with the
Okay. So the I'm trying to wrap my hands around this a little bit
plane.
still. So
No worries. It's
the
convoluted.
outer planes, there's still just like the 8 or whatever there are. Is that correct?
Pretty much, yeah. I effectively just pulled a lot of them from the Planescape books, but I did make a few changes. Like I did actually implement more than one plane of limbo, because I decided those were kind of like the trash heaps, where planes that just died off or didn't exist anymore would just kind of turn into limbo, and they would just be these planes of just pure chaos and Nothing could
Yeah, or
be
get
like livable
absorbed by
there.
the astral plane, I think is another way it can turn out.
Yeah. So there was some changes I made to it, but most of it was pretty much pulled from the Planescape books in second edition.
Okay. Um, and then you said there was multiple material planes,
Yes.
and the the simplest conception for that from the old days of D&D was like Faerun and Greyhawk being
Yes.
the two big ones,
Yeah.
and then
Ravenloft.
Ravenclaw,
Yeah. Ravenloft and
yeah,
all that. Yeah.
Ravenloft, right? Ravenclaw is the Harry Potter one.
Yeah. Which I'm actually, funny enough, playing a sort of playing a Ravenloft campaign right now,
Oh,
based on the
cool.
second edition stuff.
All right. More deadly in that era, but okay.
Yeah.
Famously.
Yep.
So where I'm getting at here is that Greyhawk and Faerun and Ravenloft all have like different gods,
Hmm.
which kind of implies that they also have different outer planes because there would be different gods like inhabiting those different outer planes.
Yeah.
How does that work for your conception of the overlapping material planes?
So effectively, I decided that the outer planes were mostly set up in a way that they were based on the alignments. So there was effectively an outer plane for each alignment, which is kind of how they were mostly already set up in second edition.
Yeah, yeah, they are pretty much set up that way, so that's not much of a stretch.
Yeah, and so effectively any gods from different settings, such as Greyhawk and Ravenloft and anything else that's out there, like Dark Sun and whatnot.
Krim was another one of the old
Mhm.
ones.
They would effectively be sharing these planes with other with the same gods of the same alignment. And so that's effectively where that kind of sat. Because then another thing too was I had created a table for just other material planes that could be out there. A lot of them being based off of just random media that I enjoyed. Like there was the plane for Tamriel from the Elder
Hmm.
Scroll games, and even other things like Pokemon, et cetera, et cetera. So I just started having fun with it at one point and decided that all these were
Okay.
just on the same track at some point, and creating some of my own planes too while I was at it. So material planes while I was at it. So they all just kind of shared the outer planes.
That's kind of interesting for Tamriel because they have a very different like conception of cosmology.
Yeah, and I honestly I didn't actually know as much about it until the one of your previous episodes with I forget their name, but a person who had used that whole thing for their own campaign.
Was Sarah?
I want to
Yeah.
say that sounds right. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. Episode 13, Sarah.
Yeah. So that I didn't know a lot about it until, like, I didn't research it as much until I heard about her talking about it. That was really my first learning of the real cosmology behind it.
Mm, yeah. Well, cool. Glad we could educate you on why you were wrong 10 years ago or whatever it was.
Yeah.
Um, so along that line for the gods, I was also kind of thinking, okay, what are they doing during all this like planar collision stuff? I mean, I guess gods are always fighting over the material plane and what's happening there. Is there something different within this event?
So pretty much I figured that the like different gods probably are popular in different material planes, since there's practically an infinite number of them.
Mhm.
If
Yeah.
one or so many planes are going to be destroyed, it's probably not too much hair off their back. They I go off of the idea that gods gain their power from their faith of their followers, and so yes, more followers means more power, but the most popular gods who have ruling in a lot of planes probably aren't going to miss one plane being lost.
Yeah, that's fair.
So that's why a lot of other figures end up getting involved. So for example, for when we were playing the original campaign, one of my players had actually gifted me a copy of the fourth edition Tomb of Horrors book. I didn't end up using it while we were still in fourth edition, and we were still too low level for it when before we switched to Pathfinder. So I had actually made a lot of notes and have a lot of sticky notes in that book, converting everything to Pathfinder type rules, and so I could use it. And I decided that Asarak wanted to use the destruction of this plane as part of like him fueling all of his different motives of uh, the numerous things that he has always been trying to accomplish. But utilizing the death of a plane was definitely within his wheelhouse, I felt. So he was one of the individuals that was definitely playing a big role in trying to profit from the destruction of a plane as well. So there was also those kind of moments
It's
of other.
interesting because I think he's actually like did do that within
I know there was.
Faerun officially.
I think yeah, there was definitely the whole thing with Moyle. That was a big part in that book for Tomb of Horrors, where Moyle was a like a at least I think it was a city that was indebted to the god Orcus, and then they basically betrayed Orcus. Orcus got mad, tossed him into another plane, and then Asarak had come upon the city and made it his own, basically. And so there's a lot of undead stuff happening in Moyle now on a separate plane. I would definitely not be surprised if he just already was working on other planes anyway.
Yeah, yeah. There was some more recent thing they did where he shows up on Faerun and
Mhm.
looks like he prevents people from being resurrected.
Yeah, yeah. No, he was definitely at one point became a important big bad in the campaign. And then there was like other things too, other groups that I tied into character backstories and whatnot who were also um, involved with trying to gain more power with what was going on. So, yeah, it definitely became a thing where there was individuals trying to profit off of it, but what they really needed was somebody who had an invested interest, which is why the whole Prometheus thing became a big idea for me.
Okay. So I guess this is somewhat related to what we were talking about there, but
Mhm.
the you said it in Faerun, and you're bringing in some like classic characters. Asarak is from Greyhawk, but whatever.
Yeah.
There's others I'm assuming that you're using. Um, which ones do you feel like you've enjoyed the most for like places, people, even like objects, I guess? There's some that are pretty important within Faerun.
So definitely some of the most important cities, just because also I'm more familiar with them, especially from the Drizzt books. Waterdeep played a big role in the whole thing, and in fact, there was a point in the campaign, secondary campaign, where they were playing through the war, where Waterdeep was being attacked by the mind controlled, and amongst things that the players were trying to accomplish to try and save the city, they actually failed, and the city ended up being overran. Even their own military force was not able to really meet up to the force of the amount that the crystal had already accomplished at this point. So Waterdeep did actually fall at one point, and there was a whole process afterwards where then they were trying to rebuild, and all the other cities then were like, "Oh well, Waterdeep fell. We need to do something." But also then turning that against Waterdeep, and a lot of infighting among cities, and some cities that were trying to like, "Hey, we really need to work together," while others were trying to keep within and protect themselves. Because then another group that was important, that is from especially the Drizzt books, is the Harpels of Longsaddle. They play a big role. So I
I don't remember them.
so they are effectively a family of wizards, pretty much, and they're very. A lot of them are very quirky. Um,
Okay. No,
there's
got it.
yeah, there's like the one wizard who turned himself into a dog. I think it was on accident, but then it kind of became a thing where he's like, you know what, I just like being a dog. I'm gonna stay a
Right.
dog.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, so they became a big part of it too, because I basically created a whole thing where, so I think originally Longsaddle was a pretty just small town out in the middle of nowhere, pretty much on the border between Icewind Dale and the rest of Faerun. And I decided that the Harpels, became such a big thing with their desire to advance the study of magic and use that to also advance the world, that Longsaddle became a much bigger city, metropolitan city, where they also created their own wizarding school effectively. And that kind of became a hub for the secondary campaign where the players would go a lot. This was one of the very few places where they actually tried making friends.
Oh,
As
okay.
I'm sure you know how a lot of players end up going. Sometimes you get too powerful for your own britches and make enemies while you're in town. At least that was my experience with a lot of my players.
Classic murder hobo.
Yes. And so they actually tried making friends in Longsaddle, and they were on very good terms with the Harpels. And so they were able to, between big events, be able to go back to Longsaddle and do things like craft magic items and etc. So this was like a big boon for them because they had a lot of high level wizards at Longsaddle that they could rely on for things.
Okay.
And which I do like that's one of the things I really like is because I'm not a big combat person. I try to use combat these days as a way to either tell part of the story or demonstrate something within the story. But I like to really focus on the characters of the story and reward them for things that they are doing well in there. So like trying to make friends, like yeah, you guys can have these powerful wizards that are willing to help you out in a lot of. So yeah, so they were also a big part of it. The Fae kind of was also had a role. At this point, I had decided that the whole Fae area was basically just devoid of life and was just overrun with undead. So that was a thing that was going on.
Thay, like the Red Wizards of Thay.
Yeah, over on the eastern side of Faerun.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds
Yeah,
accurate based off of where they were headed.
pretty much. Yeah, with the different Lich Kings and whatnot that they had.
Right.
And so that Callum also comes up a few times in the campaigns. One of my favorite things that I did was in the secondary campaign, they kind of took a break from the whole Crystal War thing and pursued some of their backstory things, and it ended up becoming a thing that I called DadCon
Uh-huh.
because there was two characters dealing with daddy issues that both their dads they had to deal with things in Calumport. One of which was one of the characters they had decided their dad was the one of those members of Waterdeep. I'm trying to remember what the name of the council is, but it's basically the ruling body where you have one.
Council 4.
Yes, thank you. So you have the one individual who's like the open member, the only person that actually shows their face, and then you have the other ones who are hidden from the public eye. And so he was one of those members and was just a generally evil character who actually worshipped Osmodeus.
Okay.
And because of the fall of Waterdeep, the player wasn't aware that his father was still alive, and so his father had reached out to him. But his father was always kind of disappointed in him. The character wasn't really following in his footsteps very well, and he was trying to still win him over, but then it turned into a confrontation where they ended up having to fight and kill his father. And then another character whose parents were both kidnapped by the Thieves Guild or as part of a whole thing with the Thieves Guild in Calumport, because they were utilizing the circus that her family was a part of as a front for basically trying to steal more money, but it effectively turned into like an enslavement of the circus because it was sold by the original owner of the circus.
This doesn't sound out of the norm necessarily for
Pretty much.
historical circuses, to be honest.
Yeah. But then basically she went, and because they weren't really treating the members of the circus very well, and she had to go, she was in communication with her parents and had to go and basically rescue them, and they effectively really messed up one branch of the Thieves Guild. And then there was just another character where he ended up leaving the campaign because, and he effectively found his quote unquote daddy in another character that he was romantically interested with. But just and then that player wanted to leave the campaign. He was a person that I was teaching the game, and he just came to a point where it was getting too high level. He was not able to keep up with everything as much, and he just wanted to step back from it.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah,
It's a complicated hobby.
yeah. So that was effectively what I call DadCon in Calimport.
Man, it feels like you've had a lot of different like adventures within Faerun.
Yeah, I was thankfully able, like, these campaigns were somewhat long running, but the overall view that I had for it was also a very long con game where uh, I was probably just trying to really flesh it out a lot, and that probably was also part of the detriment that just made it not last as long, or like not able to finish it effectively.
Okay, so Faerun, like physically, I feel like a lot of people are familiar with it, or can at least sort of look it up and be like, there's the geography makes no sense. There's forests and mountains with no rhyme or reason to how they're placed.
Yeah.
And then it's a hodgepodge of different nations, and people latch onto ones that are interesting, and then they end up having more and more history built about them. So Faerun is, at this point, effectively the Sword Coast and Thay.
Yeah, pretty much.
Nothing else gets any focus. So like the physical nature of it, I think, is well understood. And I guess my question is the political nature of your version of Faerun has 100 years or more, I guess, of at least 100 years, because it's after the death of Drizzt, and he's alive at the moment, so
yeah,
it has to be at least 100 years in the future. 100 years of history that isn't explored, and that's a lot of time. Like Faerun typically has about that much time that it's actually tracked within like its living history instead of like what was decided before it was created for first or second edition.
Mm-hmm.
I forget which.
I want to say it's probably part of second edition. I think it's when Faerun really became solidified. I want to say.
Yeah. I think it existed for first edition, but wasn't an official setting. It was just Ed Greenhood's little thing. Anyways, the point is like, what do you imagine for like the political areas for Faerun? Is it still pretty much the same? Like you mentioned, sort of like Thay is still undead, but is now sort of a wasteland instead of a dictatorship.
Yeah. So a lot of it was me trying to think of what is the current situation and how would this potentially look in the future. So a lot of the things kind of stayed similar, but sometimes they became more extreme versions of what they were before.
Yeah.
So, for example, with Waterdeep, there was still mostly the same political system in there. Definitely people who have that level of power are going to try and maintain that power. It definitely created a bigger, kind of like Waterdeep effectively felt like a lot of just discontentment amongst the population and people trying to maintain their level of power. So it felt very similar to home, but without getting too political.
Right.
And then there was other locations like Calimport, so definitely the Thieves Guild was just becoming a more and more powerful entity within it. So they were really pulling a lot of strings in the political spectrum on that end.
Well, I mean, for that specifically, like at a certain point, doesn't the Thieves Guild just become the government, and it's not really thieves anymore? It's just like an official kleptocracy.
Effectively, yeah. I think I just called it the Thieves Guild in the campaign, even just for simplicity's sake. But it effectively was that. There was just the what effectively was the Thieves Guild, just pulling all the strings in the background.
Yeah, and I've got a town in my setting that's like that. That I call it the Thieves Guild, but it's effectively they had a racketeering ring that they were running that just became so effective that they replaced the police force.
Okay, yeah. Yep.
And it's just like, okay, you're just police now, but you're calling yourselves the Thieves Guild, and you got to come pay up protection money, but it's just taxes.
Yeah. And let's see. And then there was, of course, Long Saddle, where their political spectrum was pretty much like there was a governing body. There was a that one I believe I had mostly set up as there was like effectively a sort of mayor system, but the Harpels were members of the Harpels were definitely big in terms of being what's the word I'm looking for consultants in the day-to-day things because they were definitely a big draw for income for the city. So they would often be relied upon for a lot of information. They were allowed a lot of free reign in terms of what would happen within the city. There's a lot of technological and magical advancements all within Longsaddle. So they even had things in Longsaddle like cell phones that hadn't reached the mass market yet and things like that.
Oh, okay.
So there was kind of that, whereas Longsaddle was really feeling more like a more futuristic society, effectively. Silvery Moon had some stuff going on, and that one I still left as, let's see, I believe Silvery Moon in modern times is a council effectively, but that one I'd actually turned into pretty much a monarchy where there is a usually passed down in a matriarchal line with a, they don't call her the queen, but she is effectively has that level of power. She does still have her council that she refers to, but it's primarily ran by a single entity. But it is still mostly a prosperous city. They do focus within on their own people still, and so that's usually why they're left to be able to kind of meet their own device to their own devices.
Uh, yeah. I feel like Silvery Moon was kind of heading in that direction, so that
Yeah.
definitely tracks.
So effectively, with all these main cities being the part of the main focus in the game, um, Long Saddle was definitely big on like, hey, there's this thing going on. We want to know more about it. Like they were looking at it, the whole Crystal War thing as something to study, but
Uh-huh.
also keeping in mind that this isn't looking great. We also need to make sure everyone's protected, but still being so far off to the side. Like the Crystal never even touched Long Saddle because they're just so far up to the northwest. The Crystal never went in that direction, so they were pretty much left alone. While Silvery Moon and Waterdeep were definitely big players in the game, where
Right.
they were just like Silvery Moon was trying to be the ones really leading the charge and trying to be the end up on top of the whole thing. Especially with Waterdeep having fallen, but them being so far away from Silvery Moon anyway, like them not necessarily being worried about Waterdeep, but trying to Silvery Moon trying to be the ones that look good in the end, and trying to look like the ones that everyone needs to come to for the answers. Which that actually also played another role in at one point in the secondary campaign that takes place during the war. At towards the end, I actually switched over from Pathfinder to. Are you familiar with the Quiet Year?
Yeah. Hmm.
So I actually started utilizing that system. I made a few changes and made it so there's different factions that were involved with all the factions that were involved with it. So there was Waterdeep, Silvery Moon, and the followers of Brofist, of Isaiah Brofist, and his whole people that he's getting together. And I think there was a fourth group that I had in there, but I don't remember who it was. Oh, maybe been. I think I may have thrown the Harpels in there, maybe one other one. But basically, they were kind of filling the roles of that factor in the Quiet Year where you have different groups of people that are in communication about the what's going on and making decisions on what happened, or at least talking about what's going on and trying to make decisions based on what those groups would want. So I actually ended up utilizing the Quiet Year to work out that part, and that also came up with a lot of these interactions between these major cities and groups as far as what they were wanting in the end at the once this war was resolved and how they thought the war needed to be
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought to do that for that situation, but yeah, I think it would work.
handled. Yeah, it was a bit of a stretch because the Quiet Year is more so for a time of peace, but I was utilizing it for a time of war, basically using that to lead into the final confrontation, which then we switched back to Pathfinder for the actual final fight. But that's also when that campaign fell apart because there was some tension between players that I just felt like the campaign needed to come to an end.
Yep. Yeah. That does happen.
Yeah. But yeah, so that really helped flesh out a lot of those political structures to of where everyone is at and how they are interacting with each other.
And like, how do you see like the normal like races for Faerun interacting within this landscape?
So in my setting, because of the whole events in the Drizzt books with the orcs, with what's his name, Thousand Arrows, him
Right.
trying to create a civilization for the orcs. I actually continued that and made orcs basically part of the civilized races. So at this point, they were pretty much settled as just one of the other common races, like the full orcs, not just the half orcs. And there's still, of course, some racism that's going to exist, um, especially between the dwarves and the orcs. But they were at least settled as like we have a stake in this world, like we are a part of the community. So I did make them a bigger part. Um, and so there was basically a lot less of this town is primarily this demographic, this town is primarily this demographic. Pretty much every city had every race intermingling. I was also very free with my players to play whatever race they wanted. I would usually try to work with them to do stuff. I even had at one point this character that one player that was playing a character who was effectively a succubus that got their powers taken away from them, and so they're not as powerful as a normal succubus, and just had some little throwback flavor to be a succubus that was mostly an elf, but just with some succubus stuff.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, like I allowed people to play a number of things. Like I said, I had that Warforged in there, and I even I even had one guy playing a like effectively playing a 12-year-old child as a bard. Uh,
Hmm.
so that was also a whole thing. Um, so there was a lot of races that were being involved, especially one actual thing that actually helps me come to a point on is because of the whole all the planar stuff going on, there was actually also a bigger incidence of births in what I called planar touch.
Uh-huh.
In some of the standard rules, that would involve things like the especially in Pathfinder, like the Afridi, or not the Afridi, the Ifrits, the Oreeds. So all those characters who are technically in Pathfinder considered genie folk because they're mostly born of a bloodline with Jinn in their or yeah, Jinns in their bloodline.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Um,
Then
and
these are
then
genasi within the D&D framework.
exactly, yeah. So having all of that worked in there and saying that because of all this planar stuff going on, there's more individuals being born that are of these races, even if their family, their parents don't actually have that bloodline, or if it's maybe really tucked deep into their bloodline, because there would be certain pockets around Faerun where they are kind of like not really a gateway between them and that plane, but more like there is an influence from that plane. So
Right.
like there was an area where there was an influence from the plane of negative energy, and so there was babies being born that seemed very sickly but never actually truly dying, but they kind of had this sort of just always seemed like they were very thin and emaciated but still thriving somehow. And then a lot of individuals of just like being born with like even also more tieflings being born and that kind of stuff. So there was actually an increase in that, which was also causing some questioning of what's going on with the populace and how it affects also those races being represented also in the like political structures and whatnot.
So And I think this might be me misinterpreting something, but
Mhm.
within the rules, what's implied within the separations for elves is that they're sort of more susceptible to that kind of like differentiation with like the Shatter Kai and the Dark
Mhm.
Elves
Yeah.
sort of splitting off and like mutating quickly from a sort of biology perspective, but also
Yeah.
like even within the game, I guess it's conceived as quickly
Mhm.
into a different subrace. Is that something that you thought about bringing in, or am I feel like I'm also kind of reaching a little bit far here.
No, no, that's fine. I mean, the whole thing was very convoluted to begin with. So with the elves specifically, I definitely had with the elves where there was just a lot more sort of dilution in the amongst the elves because there was also just that breakdown of high elves versus wood elves and dark elves and etc. And so there's a lot more dilution in that fact. There wasn't as much of a me emphasizing what type of elf they were, but certainly I didn't really say like, oh, it was only ever humans that were having these sort of mutations happening. I never really specified with the elves per se, but it was never only the humans that were getting that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like we kind of touched on a lot of the stuff in your survey that I wanted to for the setting. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up for it?
I think one thing, at least related to the topic I was just talking about, that was just kind of a fun little thing. I mentioned that 12-year-old boy character who was a bard. His whole thing was basically he was effectively like a ventriloquist. He started off the game with one plushie that was effectively a way for this kid to put upon this doll as this heroic character and really put all the onus on the doll rather than himself. And being a very like keeping within himself and having this doll mostly his like mouthpiece pretty much.
Like a kid playing action figures?
Exactly. And so this doll named Barkley, because it was a dog, was effectively a member, like quote unquote, a member of this organization that was fighting for plushie rights, basically, and like trying to save plushies and put them into the arms of loving children, that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff.
Okay.
And I, at one point, decided that his character was because he left a lot open in his backstory that he had given me, and I decided that his character was one of these planar touch. And as at other points, I started giving him more dolls, and he was giving them different personalities. So I was like, okay, so this is a kid with like effectively some sort of personality disorder. And I decided that the source of that was because his character, so just to be able to refer to him easier, his name is Poggle. I decided that Poggle was actually a technically a stillbirth, where he died in the womb. The actual soul of Poggle was no longer in this body. And what there actually was do this whole planar touch thing that I had came up with. There was a he was effectively planar touched from the ethereal plane, and there was five other souls that were kind of within the vicinity that were kind of put together to be one being within this child's body. So him using these dolls was effectively him giving more of a voice to one soul over the rest.
Okay. So he's like a collective ghost haunting a child that was actually dead.
Pretty much. And so them all collectively together create what is Poggle. But there is no single soul of Poggle. There is the collective that has become Poggle. So the way that I started kind of showing this was the first time that it happened was they were all stuck in a no, he got stuck in a prison in Silvery Moon. They had done some stuff that wasn't a great idea. They could have asked nicely, but instead they just decided to steal something from the government. and Poggle ends up in prison. How badly does your character want to get out of this prison cell? He's like, yeah, I would really like to get out of this prison cell. And I was like, okay. And then I cut away to the rest of the party and let them kind of work out, like, we got to go back, we got to go save the kid, and blah blah blah. And they were talking about it, and then they're getting ready to go into Silver Moon, try and get him out, and there's Poggle. Just he just comes out of he just kind of walks through the trees, and there he is. And I explained to the character that basically he just felt himself kind of slip away and feel like he was able, and kind of realize that he could just walk through the walls, because he effectively just became ethereal at that point because of his contact with the ethereal plane. Effectively, I started developing these things where like he would kind of start having these ethereal type powers. So he uncontrollably became ethereal, met up with the rest of the party once he became physical again. And then later, there was a character, an NPC, or not an NPC, but a PC that was there briefly, who was casting the detect thought spell. And I told him, you look at this child and you hear 5 different voices going on. And then later, eventually the player who owned Poggle left the game. And I wanted to keep Poggle in the game because there was so much interesting things that I had planned for him.
Just thinking you could have a different player come in and play him and just change the personality, and it kind of fits with the character.
Pretty much. But another thing that happened was there was a character that died, and they were kind of left floating for a moment in the ethereal plane, waiting to either be brought back to life or be sent off to the afterlife.
Right.
And I tell them, like, you, because of the fogginess of the ethereal plane, and they can't quite see everything on the material plane, but I'm like, you see very clearly where you remember Poggle being in this combat. You see this amalgamation of souls standing there, and that created this whole fear within that character and a meta fear within the party that Poggle was some sort of elder being trapped with, that was masquerading as a child, which then treated the way that they treated Poggle for the rest of the campaign, until they finally kind of figured out what he actually was. They were able to gather enough information based on things that were going on and looking at him and what he truly was. I was able to give him pretty much the gist of what he actually was. And at one point, he actually even lost one of the souls during the Tomb of Horror campaign, where they were facing off with this creature that had the ability to absorb souls. And so I decided he didn't die, but he lost one of his souls, and it really affected his ability to function.
Okay. That's a cool idea.
Yeah, so that kind of stuff was a lot of fun of what I did with an aspect of that campaign.
Yeah, that does sound really interesting, and there's a lot of different things you could do with that concept.
Yeah,
it's really neat.
Yeah, otherwise, I think I feel like I covered the majority of the aspects of the game, not remembering anything else in particular that comes to mind, unless you have any other questions about it.
Well, I did have another question.
Sure.
So we talked about it a bit before, where you were sort of going away from violence as a resolution mechanic somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
How are you feeling? You said you were creating a system that kind of had that as an intention.
Yeah, so that's definitely something that probably in the future, when I have it more fleshed out, I would be more than happy to come back on the podcast and talk a little bit more about that whole thing. But I can definitely give you a preview of what that system is about.
Yeah, I'd like that.
So the idea of the system, it's going to be definitely one of those narrative-based systems. Like, I've definitely heard you guys talking about, for example, oh wow, I'm blanking on names.
Powered by the Apocalypse and Forged in the Dark are the big ones.
Yes, and there's that one in particular with it's the one where the original conceit of it is that there's like these elder beings that they have to There's people that go down, take their blood, and come back to use that as energy fuel source.
Yeah, that's part of Blades in the Dark,
Blaze in the
which
Dark. There
is
we go.
the
Yeah.
original system that the Forged in the Dark
Yes. There we go.
system is based off of.
Yeah. So, because one of the things too, some of my familiarity with some of the systems comes also from me listening to the Adventure Zone. I'm a big fan of the McElroy brothers.
Mm-hmm. Yep, they're good.
So them playing Blades in the Dark definitely gave me a lot of ideas. I'm also have played a few other different systems that are not D&D, namely like with Quiet Year that I had played. I had also have played Fate at one point. I almost played GURPS, but never actually started the game.
That sounds about right.
And just like other things where I'm just, especially with playing things like D&D and Pathfinder, where definitely a lot of the mechanics are really towards combat. Unless you're playing something like a bard or a rogue, but even those classes still have a lot of things like their spells and their abilities in the end are really driven towards combat. And there's a
Yeah.
lot of aspects where I feel like it also there's a lot of rules and a lot of things that they stipulate, but sometimes that also takes away from some of the freedom of what the players could be doing. So, some of the things that I am developing in this system is that I want it to be a more of each thing is going to be a conversation between me and the players of I want to accomplish this thing. Let's figure out the stats that are appropriate for it. Roll our dice. Instead of having a class system, I'm actually completely doing away with that. So there's not going to be your like stereotypical fighters, rogues, mages, etc. It's instead going to be where each character is going to have a list of stats that are broken down in different ways. So you have your three core stats: your body, your mind, and your presence, which are then broken down into smaller components. And those are currently broken down to smaller components as well, for which has a whole other concept behind it. And as they develop these abilities, they can put points into things to be able to do different things like cast fire spells, which are going to be separated from other types of spells, and like there's water-based spells, et cetera, et cetera. But also there's aspects in this where you could do, for example, something very similar to the cleave feat in Pathfinder, and also I think comes up in D&D fifth
Yeah.
edition, where you can like attack multiple enemies with a single strike of your weapon. Also, though, there's a whole social aspect I'm also trying to really develop in the game, where because there's the body, mind, and presence. There's a whole presence is really going to be focused on your social abilities, and so there's also things that are kind of semi-magical, but are aspects of the game where you can do these like really big crazy things with just your ability of presence that will allow the players to really try to come up with the conceit of their character and how they want to be able to meet with challenges, how to be able to solve these challenges rather than just having the one thing. And so instead of being like I am a fighter, these are the things that I can do with my abilities, but rather being able to pick and choose what makes their characters. So if they want to be able to do things like utilize a sword, but also cast certain types of spells, or also be very deceptive or very um, having a great ability at inspiring people and whatnot, or being very lucky even. So instead,
Okay.
so to be able to advance their characters, something that I'm playing with, and I haven't quite decided how the scaling is going to work with it, is that instead of having a level-based system as well, so characters aren't going to have character levels. Instead, you basically kind of similar to I want to say it's Monster of the Week, the Powered by the Apocalypse system, where
Uh-huh.
you get experience points by failures and stuff like that, I think.
Yeah.
And so I wanted a system where the more you're using these abilities, you get experience points specifically for that ability. And so the stat goes up based on the experience from you utilizing that ability. And certainly characters will get more experience when they fail. So they'll get like a little bit each time they use they use that stat. They get more for failure, and then there'll be other ways for them to gain experience, like training and stuff like that. But effectively, then they're advancing skills by utilizing them rather than having to wait for a level up or something. So dealing away with that, and also dealing away with hit points. Instead of having hit points, this is the part where it gets a little complicated, and I'm kind of wondering how I actually want to implement this. But instead of having like a set number of hit points, I kind of want to have a system where they are there's a certain amount of harm being dealt based on the rolls that they make. And if they reach a certain threshold of harm, then they receive an injury, and that's something that will actually start weakening stats and making it like they have a broken leg, so their speed goes down. And then every time they gain a new injury, then they have to roll to stay conscious. And so there's going to be a stat associated with being able to stay conscious, or effectively like being left in the game. And so it's not just consciousness really, because then trying to stray away from using that actually using that word, because receiving these injuries, there's not just bodily injuries, but also you could be receiving mental injuries and social injuries that you could be, say, like you're trying to have a confrontation with somebody where you're trying to either deceive them or intimidate them, and maybe they're taking injuries in that aspect, and so they can be taken out of the whole conflict by like they've taken so much mental damage that like they're just not able to function anymore. Or social damage, they have hit a point where
yeah, like you're trying to impress this like person at a party, and then you take enough social damage that you're like you're humiliated at the party, and now you can't really do anything anymore.
Yes, exactly. So having those aspects in there, so like it's not just physical damage you're taking, but just other ways that you could be incapacitated effectively.
Yeah, I've definitely seen other games do that where like they sort of have a physical tracker for damage and a separate mental tracker where, yeah, like one of them was like you become discouraged if you run out of your mental points, and then your character has to like doesn't feel adequate to take this challenge on anymore and has to go like take a break.
Yeah, and especially with things like I really love the whole that system in Blades of the Dark with the downtime activities and the your like vice, which helps you. What was it? I think they had stamina in the game. I think.
Stress.
Stress. There we go. Yes. So I really liked things like that, and being able to make those actual mechanics in the game that characters can play with. All right, there was something that you said that triggered some other thought, and I don't remember what that was anymore.
The discouraged, like when they get knocked out, they have to go sort of sit down and take a break from mental damage.
Oh, actually, no. You know what I think it was? I was just going to comment on the whole physical and mental things, because it's also like anything that you play that's Lovecraftian in nature. There's always the physical and sanity damage going on. So that was also kind of another thing that I was thinking about with that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and some of the games I was thinking of are definitely that split where you have your physical damage and then your stability, sanity kind of stuff that is also tracked there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much the idea of it currently in a nutshell. There's a lot of kinks and things I'm trying to work through, and trying to keep it as simple as possible, because I do want it to be a system where you could easily make a character, pick it up, and play pretty easily. It's nothing I'm going to try and profit on or anything like that. I'm not going to publish it or anything like that. Whenever I start like trying to turn hobbies into something that I could potentially do, then I start losing interest in it. The only thing where it's like my love of animals, which is why I'm in the veterinary field, like my love of animals is enough where I could do it as a job and enjoy it. But if I start trying to turn things like linguistics into a job, I'm like, that feels like I'm just drudging through it instead of getting to do what I do every day. With my whole system, trying to turn it into like something that I would eventually try to profit off of. I'm not going to worry about anything like that. It's going to be more of just a tool for me to potentially play a game with my friends and whatnot. Maybe get other people interested into TTRPGs. Try and make it something that is as user friendly as possible.
Yeah. My friend's dad, John, who's also been on an episode, has been working on his own system.
Nice.
And he's reached the point where he doesn't really want to sort of super focus on developing the system and getting it sort of sold anymore. He's kind of reached a point where like this is good.
Yeah.
And as he said, I'm 60. I don't have to do what other people expect of me anymore. I don't have to do anything I don't want to, and I don't want to do that, so I'm done. Yeah. And he put it up on itch.io, and if anyone wants it, they can go get it.
Nice. Yeah. I feel like I would probably do something like that too, because like especially once I have it fleshed out, like certainly if I come back onto your podcast and talk about it, then that would at least be another avenue for people to hear about it.
Well, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so that'd be like one. That certainly would be one thing too, because I also already went through all that too. A very long time ago. I also play a lot of board games. And a very long time ago, I was working with a old friend to try and make our own board game, and we even got to a point where we actually bought a copyright for at least the name.
Oh, wow.
And then it eventually fell apart. We kept on hitting this creative wall. The game was not quite becoming what we wanted it to become. And we eventually just kind of like stopped meeting up for it. We still see each other like once in a while, but we just don't even talk about the game anymore. Like I actually still have like components that we had created for playtesting and stuff that like I have laying around the house. That it all fell apart, and I already kind of was like also feeling the drudge of it. I was like, I don't know that I could see this through completion either, and all of us just reached that point where we just lost steam on it.
Yeah, well, that's I can't even remember some of the projects I had like that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I always close out by asking if you have any advice for other DMs. So you have anything you wanna share?
One of the big things that I tell a lot of people when I'm teaching new people is mostly just remember it's a game. And I feel like a lot of your other guests have basically said the same thing. But I remember when I first started DMing, I was being a little too serious with it. I was doing mechanics that were making the game challenging, but not in a fun way. And I had to come to realize that I also needed to make sure I was catering to my players, and always checking in with my players and saying, hey, how did you like the session? What were some things that worked for you? What were some things that didn't work for you? Trying to remember, it's all just a game. We're all trying to have fun. Never want anyone to feel like they're being singled out or not getting what they want out of the game. And sometimes if players are just not meshing, because I definitely have had this issue in the past, if you have players that want totally different game styles and it's not working out, maybe you just need to separate out those people into different games or something.
It's so strange that like D&D has that within the hobby, but a lot of other hobbies that are more like sport focused, like you would never think of sort of at the end of a pickup basketball session being like, hey guys, what did you like about that? What did you not like about it? It's just like, I don't know, it's basketball. What are you talking about? There are sort of breakdowns of like practice and games and like how you can improve for the future, but when you're just doing it for fun, it's kind of not the focus.
Yeah. And plus, I mean, a lot of what we're doing too is theater of the mind, so we got to see what our brains want too.
Yeah. Well, cool. Thanks, Dylan. This was really cool.
No problem. Thank you for having me
would love to hear more about that system you're working on if it doesn't get left on the wayside like the board game project.
Hopefully not. This one I am still feeling a good amount of passion about it, and I'm currently in the middle of. I've already created a character sheet for it effectively.
Hmm.
Mostly just working on actually flushing out rules. I'm not going to be super detailed in the book and mostly just trying to put everything into bullet points, but trying to at least like flush out a rule book for it. Try to keep as few pages as possible.
Yeah, first draft.
Yeah. So yeah,
Okay.
hopefully I get to finish it out.
Well, yeah. When you get there, yeah, we can talk again. That'd be cool.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, Dylan.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You too. If you enjoyed listening to today's episode, then please tell a friend, and thank you for listening.